He found the girl first because she wasn't moving. The boy was moving, swinging a broken fence slat at Caleb's face with everything he had left, screaming, "Don't touch her!" through cracked and bleeding lips, putting his whole frozen body between a dying child and a stranger. Caleb caught the slat with one hand, held it, looked past the boy at the little girl in the snow, at the blue of her lips, at the hand curled stiff and bare against the white ground. His chest did something it hadn't done in 3 years. He let go of the slat. He knelt down anyway. If this story reaches your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow every part to the very end. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. The rope was still on the fence post when Caleb Harrow rode the north line that morning. He almost missed them. The snow was coming down sideways, the kind that turned the world into one white wall. And his mind was in the place it usually lived. Nowhere useful, nowhere warm. 3 years of riding fence line on a ranch that didn't need tending had given him a talent for being present in body and gone in every other way that mattered. His horse stopped him. Didn't spook, didn't slow. Just locked all 4 legs and refused. Ears pitched hard forward, breath cutting short. Caleb followed the line of its attention, and that was when he saw the shapes against the post. 2 of them. Small. He dismounted. The boy came off the ground so fast, Caleb barely had time to register the fence slat before it cracked across his left forearm, hard enough to bruise through the coat. The kid had nothing left and still swung like he had everything to lose. "Back off!" Raw voice, frost-white hair, eyes that had gone past fear into something that lived on the other side of it. "Back off right now, or I swear to God—" "Easy." Caleb caught the next swing one-handed, held the slat, didn't pull it away. "Easy, son." "I ain't your son." The boy yanked against his grip and got nowhere. "Let go." "I'm going to let go. I'm going to step back. And then you're going to let me look at her." Caleb released the slat and stepped back 2 full paces, hands open at his sides. "Because she needs help, and you know it." The boy, blond, hollow-cheeked, wearing a man's coat rolled 6 times at the sleeves, stood between Caleb and the girl like a door that hadn't decided whether to open or stay shut. His right boot had a hole clear through the sole. He'd been standing in Wyoming snow all night, with his foot half in the open air. Caleb looked past him. The girl was curled on her side, knees drawn up. Dark, curly hair matted against her forehead under a wool cap. One mitten gone. The bare hand was red and wrong-shaped, curled in on itself. Her lips weren't blue anymore. They were past blue. And her chest. Caleb watched it. There, a rise, shallow and slow, but there. "How long?" Caleb said. The boy's jaw worked. "What?" "How long has she been like that?" Silence. The wind answered instead. "She was talking at sundown," the boy said finally, voice stripped of everything but the fact. "She stopped talking around midnight. I kept saying her name. She'd squeeze my hand. She stopped doing that maybe 2 hours ago." "She's alive." "I know she's alive." Fast, fierce. "I know that." "Then let me help her stay that way." Caleb took 1 step. The boy raised the slat. Caleb stopped. "What's your name?" A beat. "Jesse." "Jesse. My ranch is 12 minutes south. I've got a stove, blankets, hot broth. 12 minutes. He looked directly at the boy, not past him, not around him, at him. "She doesn't have much more than 12 minutes. You know that too." Jesse looked down at his sister, just for a second. And in that second, Caleb saw the whole terrible weight of it. The night this boy had spent, the cold he'd fought through, the prayers he'd made in whatever way 9-year-olds prayed when the world went completely wrong. The slat lowered. "She's Nora," Jesse said, like the name was something he needed to protect by saying it first. "Her name is Nora." Caleb knelt. He pulled off his right glove and pressed 2 fingers to the girl's wrist. The pulse was there, thin as a thread, stubborn as a splinter. He slid one arm beneath her knees. "I've got you, Nora." Her eyes opened, not all the way, just a crack. Dark brown, enormous, lost. She looked at Caleb's face and her brow pulled together slightly. Not recognition, not fear, something quieter than either. Her lips moved. Nothing came out. Then her eyes slid sideways to her brother, and whatever was holding her together seemed to ease just slightly. "Jesse," she breathed. "Right here." Jesse was already at her side, one frozen hand finding hers. "Right here. This man's gonna help, okay?" "I said okay." Nora's fingers closed around her brother's hand and stayed there. Caleb stood with her against his chest, and that was when he saw it. Above where she'd been lying, tied to the fence post with a length of rope, cut, not untied, the ends still frayed, was a scrap of brown paper pinned with a bent nail. Block letters, charcoal or ash. He read it in 2 seconds. "Unwanted. No use to anyone. Leave them." His jaw set so hard it ached. He looked at Jesse. The boy was watching him read it, chin lifted, waiting for whatever Caleb's face was going to do. Waiting to be disappointed. Waiting for the thing adults always did when they found out a child came with a price tag of nothing. Caleb reached up and tore the paper off the nail. He crumpled it in his fist until it tore. He put it in his coat pocket. He didn't say anything about it. He just turned to the horse. "Get up," he said to Jesse. "I'll hand her to you. Hold her until I mount." Jesse hesitated one more second. Then he grabbed the saddle horn and pulled himself up. Caleb lifted Nora carefully, and Jesse took her, both arms locked tight, the fence slat forgotten in the snow behind him. Caleb mounted behind them both, and pulled his coat open and wrapped it around Nora's small frame and nudged the horse south. Jesse didn't lean back, sat rigid as a fence post himself, spine straight, not taking anything he hadn't agreed to take. Caleb didn't comment. He'd earned that stiffness. "Almost there," Caleb said into the wind. To Nora, mostly. Maybe to himself. Inside, he worked without wasting motion. Nora on the cot closest to the stove. Wet layers off, wool blankets on, layered tight. Fire stoked until it roared like it was offended by the cold. Water on to heat. Broth on after that. Beef and salt and carrot. Simple and honest. The kind of food that didn't ask anything from you. Jesse stood in the center of the room and watched every single thing Caleb did. Every reach, every movement, cataloging, measuring, waiting for the moment the pretending stopped and the real thing underneath showed itself. "Coat off," Caleb said without turning. "You're soaked through." "I'm fine." "You'll be warmer without it." "I said I'm fine." Caleb turned around, looked at the boy, said nothing else. Just held his gaze for 3 seconds, and then turned back to the stove. The sound of the coat hitting the floor came 8 seconds later. Caleb reached into the trunk, pulled out an old flannel shirt, set it on the table. Heard Jesse pick it up. The broth was ready. He set a bowl in front of the empty chair. "I'm not leaving her," Jesse said. "She'll sleep for a while. Sit down." "You don't know that." "I've seen fever before." Caleb pulled out the chair. "Sit down, Jesse. Please." The please did something. Caleb had noticed that about children who'd been handled roughly. The word please came at them sideways, unexpected, like something they didn't quite have a category for. Jesse sat. He picked up the spoon with both hands wrapped around it, held it a moment, then took one careful bite. Then another. 4 bites, measured. Then he put the spoon down. "You live out here alone," Jesse said. Not a question. "Yes." "Long time?"
3 years.
Jesse looked around the room, taking inventory the way people did when they were deciding if a place was safe or just the next kind of trouble. His eyes stopped on the mantel, Clara's photograph. The small one in the wooden frame, the only picture Caleb had of her. "She die?" Jesse asked. Direct. Caleb had to respect it.
"Yes. Our mama died in October."
Same flat voice, same stripped-down delivery that said, "I have told myself this enough times that the words don't bleed anymore."
"Fever took her in 4 days."
Caleb set his coffee down. "I'm sorry." Jesse looked at him steadily. "People say that." "I mean it." "People say that too." Caleb sat down across from him. He didn't argue. The fire cracked between them, and the wind pushed at the walls, looking for a way in, and Nora breezed in the cot with the slow, stubborn rhythm of someone who hadn't gotten the message that she was supposed to stop. "After Mama died," Jesse said, staring at the table, "a man called Aldrich came. Said Mama owed him money. Said we'd work off her debt." The spoon turned slowly in his fingers. "We ran. Been running 2 weeks." "Who tied you to that post?" "Man who works for Aldrich. Name of Silas Vane." Jesse said it clean, like he'd rehearsed the sound of it, like saying it out loud was the only power he had over it. "He caught up to us 3 days back. He said—" A pause, short, controlled. "He said the cold would handle it. Said by morning there wouldn't be 2 children. There'd just be snow." Caleb's hands were flat on the table. Still. "He wanted you dead," Caleb said. "Not gone. Dead." "Yes." "Why?" Jesse looked up, and here it was. The real thing, the one that had been sitting under everything since Caleb pulled them off that fence post. The reason the note said unwanted instead of just gone. The reason Silas Vane hadn't simply dropped them at a county home or driven them to the next town. The reason 2 children had to be erased instead of just discarded. "The night Mama died," Jesse said quietly, "there was another man at our place. Man named Cooper. He'd come to collect the debt, same as Aldrich." His voice dropped further. "Aldrich didn't want to pay Cooper what he owed him. So he didn't." Jesse's hands went still on the table. "Nora was under the bed. I was at the window. We both saw the whole thing." The fire popped. Outside the wind moaned low and long, the sound of Wyoming winter, reminding everything inside a house that walls were a temporary argument. "Aldrich is running for territorial judge," Jesse continued. "Vane told us that too, right before he tied us up. Said it real slow, like he wanted us to understand how small we were. Said a county judge had long arms." He met Caleb's eyes. "We're the only witnesses, a 9-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl. He wasn't wrong that nobody would look too hard." Caleb stood up, slow and deliberate. He went to the trunk at the foot of the bed, the bottom drawer. The one that had stayed closed for 3 years because opening it meant admitting that the man who owned what was inside wasn't as finished as he'd told himself. He reached past Clara's Bible, couldn't give it away, couldn't open it, to the flat leather case at the back. He set it on the table between them. Jesse watched him open it. Inside the case, on a square of worn felt, sat a U.S. Marshal's badge. Seven-pointed star, silver gone dark with time. Deputy U.S. Marshal, Wyoming Territory, stamped clean along the bottom. Jesse stared at it for a long moment. "Your law," he said. "Was. What happened?" Caleb looked at the badge, at the photograph on the mantel, at the window where the snow came down without apology. "Same thing that happens," he said. "Life." Jesse was quiet. He looked at the badge, then at Caleb, then back at the badge, and something in the careful armor of his face shifted. Not broke, not softened, just shifted. The way a locked door shifts when someone puts in the right key and doesn't yet turn it. "Man like Aldrich," Jesse said carefully, "with money and the law office and people who owe him things." He paused. "That's a hard thing to go against." "Yes," Caleb said. "Could get somebody killed." "Could." Jesse looked at him with those complicated blue-green eyes that had seen more than they should have and filed every bit of it away for safekeeping. "Then why would you?" Caleb picked up a leather case, held it in both hands. 3 years ago, he'd put it in the drawer because the world had taken the last thing that made it worth carrying. He stood there in the firelight, with 2 half-frozen children in his house, and a killer running for territorial judge, and the snow coming down like the world intended to bury everything that wasn't nailed down. Because someone should have, a long time ago, he said, and no one did. From the cot, small and quiet as a held breath, Nora's voice came. "Jesse." Both of them turned. Her eyes were open, really open this time, focused and present, dark and warm as river stones. She was looking at her brother with the particular intensity of a child who had been somewhere very cold and very far, and had just found her way back. Jesse crossed the room in 4 steps and dropped to his knees beside the cot. He took her hand. He didn't say anything. He just held on. Nora looked past him at Caleb, her brow furrowed slightly, the same way it had when she'd first seen him in the snow. Then she looked back at Jesse. "He bring us in?" she asked, voice barely there. "Yeah." She was quiet a moment. Then, "He got any food?" Jesse made a sound that might, under different circumstances, have been a laugh. "He's got broth." Nora considered this with the gravity it deserved. Then she nodded once, small and certain, and looked at Caleb directly. "Thank you," she said, like the words were something she'd decided to mean. Caleb sat back down. He picked up his coffee. He kept his face even. "You're welcome, Nora." He put the leather case on the table where he could see it. Outside, the wind found the paper in his coat pocket, the torn scrap with its ugly block letters. And when Caleb stepped out an hour later to check the barn, he stood at the fence post where he'd found them and took the crumpled note out of his pocket and held it in the wind until it tore the rest of the way and the pieces scattered out across the white field and disappeared. Unwanted. He watched the last piece go. Then he turned back toward the house, where the light from the stove window pushed yellow and warm out into the dark, and he walked toward it. 12 miles north, on a road that nobody used anymore, Silas Vane would be learning by morning that the cold hadn't handled it. That somewhere between the fence post and the nothing that was supposed to follow, something had gone wrong with his plan. Caleb didn't know yet exactly what kind of man Silas Vane was when plans went wrong. He intended to find out. 3 days passed before Nora stood up on her own. Not because she wasn't trying. She tried on the second morning, swung her legs over the edge of the cot before anyone was awake, and made it approximately 1 step before her knees decided they had a different opinion. Caleb heard the sound and was across the room in 4 steps. He caught her by the arms before she hit the floor. She looked up at him from his grip with absolutely no embarrassment. "I was testing," she said. "How'd that go?" "Poorly." She let him put her back on the cot. "I'll try again tomorrow." "You'll try again when the fever's been gone 2 full days." "Who decided that?" "Medicine decided that. I'm just the one saying it out loud." Nora looked at him with those dark, serious eyes that seemed to run several calculations simultaneously, and then reached a verdict. "You're bossy," she said. "Yes," Caleb agreed. "Jesse's bossy too." She pulled the blanket back up. "I don't like bossy people." "I know. But I like you, okay?" She said it plainly, the way children said plain things, without decoration or apology. Then she closed her eyes and went back to sleep. Caleb stood there for a moment. Then he went back to his chair by the fire and sat down and stared at the wall for a while. Jesse was watching him from across the room. He'd been sleeping on the floor beside the cot, wrapped in 2 blankets, his back against the wall where he could see both the door and his sister at the same time. He hadn't said anything about the sleeping arrangement, hadn't asked permission, had simply put himself there like a guard post and stayed. "She does that," Jesse said. "Does what?" "Decides she likes somebody and then just tells them." He was picking at a loose thread in his blanket, not looking up. "She decided she liked a stray dog once in about 10 seconds. Named it Henry. Cried for a week when it left." Caleb looked at the boy. "That a warning?" Jesse shrugged, one shoulder. "Just telling you how she is." He pulled the thread loose and studied it. "She gives things away fast, always has." "And you don't?" "No," Jesse said, short and simple, and not an apology. "That's all right," Caleb said. "I don't need it." Jesse looked up at that. Something shifted behind his eyes, quick and private. Then he looked back at the thread. On the 4th morning, the fever broke clean. Nora woke up hungry in a way she hadn't been since she'd arrived. Real hungry. The kind that meant the body had stopped spending all its resources on survival and had started thinking about the future. She ate a full bowl of oats and then looked at the pot and said, "Is there more?" Caleb gave her the rest of it. Jesse ate his own bowl, with marginally less restraint than he had the first night. He was still careful, still deliberate. But the 4 measured bites had become 8, and he'd stopped watching the pot like he expected someone to take it back. Small things. But Caleb had learned, in 11 years of reading people, that small things were the only things that told the truth. On the 5th day, Caleb had to go to town. He told them at breakfast. Said it out plainly. He needed supplies. The roads were passable for a day at least, and he'd be back before dark. He watched their faces while he said it. Nora nodded and asked if he could bring back something sweet if there was anything available. Jesse said nothing, but his jaw tightened by a fraction, and his eyes went to the window the way eyes went to exits. "You'll be here when I get back," Caleb said, directly to Jesse. Not a question, not a command. Something in between. Jesse looked at him. "You don't know that." "I'm asking." A long silence. Nora had gone very still, watching her brother the way she always did when something important was being decided. Jesse's gaze moved from Caleb to his sister and back again. "We'll be here," Nora said, before Jesse could answer. Jesse shot her a look. She returned it with perfect calm. Some kind of negotiation passed between them that had no words and didn't need any. The particular silent language of 2 people who had been each other's only company for a long time. Jesse's shoulders dropped a 1/4 inch. "We'll be here," he said. Coldwater was 12 miles of frozen road and wind that came at a man sideways and didn't apologize. Caleb rode it with his hat pulled low and his mind on the list in his pocket. and also on the other thing, the thing that had been sitting in the back of his thoughts since Jesse said the name Thomas Aldrich. He knew the name. Not well, not personally, but he knew it the way a man knew certain weather patterns. You recognized it by the damage it left. Aldrich had been a land speculator 3 years back, buying up parcels along the route everybody knew the new railroad line was going to take, using county connections to get the surveys early, using other methods for the holdouts who wouldn't sell. Caleb had been building a case against him when Clara got sick, and then the case stopped mattering. Now Aldrich was running for territorial judge, had enough money and enough favors owed to him that the appointment was, by most accounts, a formality. A judge with Aldrich's history and Aldrich's debts was a very specific kind of disaster. The kind that wore a black robe and sat above the law and made itself impossible to touch. Unless someone touched it first. Caleb tied his horse in front of Calloway's general and went inside. Ruth Calloway was 60 years old, had been running the store since her husband fell off a roof in 1869, and had developed, over that time, an ability to read what a person actually needed that bore almost no relationship to what they said they were there for. She looked at Caleb over the counter with sharp gray eyes and said, "You look like something happened." "Need supplies," Caleb said. "Everybody needs supplies. That's why they come to a general store." She came around the counter, pulled a basket off the hook. "You're buying for more than one person." It wasn't a question. Caleb handed her the list. Ruth read it. Didn't say anything for a moment. She walked the aisles pulling things down. Flour, salt, the oats, 2 tins of beans, a small jar of sourwood honey. When she put the honey on the counter, she looked at him again. "Children's sizes," she said. Caleb said nothing. "I'm not asking your business," Ruth said, setting a pair of boots on the counter, small, solid, with good soles. "I'm telling you I had these in the back, boy size and girl size. Came in last fall with an order that never got claimed." She pushed them forward. "They're yours if you want them." Caleb looked at her. "Don't look at me like that," Ruth said. "I'm old, and I run a store in a cold town. Let me do something useful if I want to." Caleb put the boots in his bag. "Much obliged."
While you're here,
Ruth's voice dropped. Not dramatic, just careful. The voice of someone who'd learned that information in the small town had weight and needed to be handled accordingly. "Man came through yesterday, well dressed for this weather, asking around about a couple of children. Said he was a county welfare official, looking for 2 orphans who'd run off from a placement." Caleb's hands went still on the counter. "He had papers," Ruth continued, "official-looking ones. Had Aldrich's office stamp on them." She straightened a row of tins that didn't need straightening. "I told him I hadn't seen any children. 3 other people in town told him the same thing." She glanced up. "Not because I told them to. They just didn't like the look of him." "What did he look like?" "Like someone who smiled with his mouth and thought with something that wasn't his eyes." Ruth set a small paper-wrapped package on the counter beside the honey. "Peppermint sticks. Don't tell me you don't need them." Caleb picked up the package. "Did he say his name?" "Vane," Ruth said. "Silas Vane. Said he'd be staying at the Dumont boarding house for a few days, in case anyone remembered anything useful." She met Caleb's gaze straight on. "I've lived in this town 30 years. I know a welfare official, and I know a man who wants something found before someone else finds it. That man wants something found." "Yes," Caleb said. "Those children at your place." "Yes." Ruth nodded once. Finished tallying the order, wrote the number on a slip of paper, and pushed it across the counter. "You were a marshal," she said. "Before." "Yes." "You still think like one?" Caleb picked up his bag. "Apparently." "Good." Ruth went back to her side of the counter. Because a man running for territorial judge, with Silas Vane doing his errands, is not a small problem. And small problems are all this town is equipped to handle. She looked at him steadily.
You'll need more than a ranch and a rifle. I know. I know people, Ruth said simply. When you're ready, you tell me.
Caleb settled his hat. Thank you, Ruth. Bring the children in when the roads are better. I'll have more boots. She turned back to her work. And Caleb, use the south road home, the long way around. He took the south road. He got back to the ranch with an hour of daylight left, gray and fading fast. He tied the horse and carried the bags inside and found Jesse standing at the window with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and Nora sitting cross-legged on the cot with the small wooden bird Caleb had left on the table 3 days ago, turning slowly in her fingers. She'd found it on her own. He hadn't said anything about it. You were gone a long time, Jesse said, not accusing, just noting it. Roads were slow. Caleb set the bags on the table. He took out the peppermint sticks and set them beside Nora without comment. Her eyes went wide. She picked one up and looked at it, and then looked at him like he'd performed a minor miracle. You remembered, she said. I was told to, Caleb said honestly. Jesse was still at the window. Anything happen in town? He said, still not looking away from the glass. Caleb set the boots on the table, boy size first. Jesse turned from the window and looked at them. Something moved across his face, quick and ungovernable. And then it was gone, behind the usual, careful nothing. Those for me? He asked. Yours have a hole in the sole. I know that. Then yes, they're for you. Jesse picked up the boot, turned it over, set it down. You didn't have to do that. I know, Caleb said. Jesse looked at him for a moment. Then he sat down and pulled off his old boot and put on the new one and laced it without another word. But his ears were red, and it wasn't from the cold. Caleb put the girl's boots beside Nora, who had already eaten half the peppermint stick, and was examining the other boot with the thoroughness of someone who intended to have an opinion. These got flowers on them, she said, pointing to the stitching at the toe. They do. I like flowers. Lucky. She beamed at him with a peppermint-stained smile. Then Caleb sat down at the table and looked at both of them, and something in his posture must have communicated itself, because Jesse stopped fussing with the bootlace, and Nora stopped examining the stitching, and they both went still and waited. A man named Silas Vane is in Coldwater, Caleb said. He was asking about you. He had papers with Aldrich's office seal on them. Jesse's face went flat and white. Not surprised, just the look of someone whose worst expectation had been confirmed. Nora's hand closed around the wooden bird. He doesn't know you're here, Caleb continued. Nobody in town told him anything. But he's staying at the boarding house, which means he's not giving up. He'll ask again. He'll push. And eventually someone will say the wrong thing without meaning to, or he'll figure out the geography on his own. So we have to run, Jesse said, flat, like he'd known this was always going to be the sentence. No, Caleb said. Jesse blinked. No? Running got you tied to a fence post in the snow. Caleb put both hands flat on the table. You're done running. Then what? I'm going to need you to tell me everything. Every detail of what you saw that night. Every word Vane said. Every piece of it, from the beginning. Because if Aldrich gets that judgeship, he'll have legal authority over every piece of land and every person in this territory. And a judge can make 2 children disappear a lot of different ways that don't require snow. He looked at Jesse directly. But if I have witnesses, real ones, with a real account of what happened to a real man named Cooper, that changes things. Jesse was very still. You'd go after Aldrich. I'd go after Aldrich. He's got money. He's got connections. He's got Vane, and probably half a dozen men like Vane." "I know." "And you'd still—" Jesse stopped. He looked at Caleb with something that was working its way towards something else, slowly, against significant internal resistance. "Why?" "Because it's right," Caleb said. "And because you're here. And because I told you I'm not someone who leaves children in the snow. That goes for the cold kind and the other kind both." Silence. The fire crackled. Nora was watching her brother with those enormous dark eyes, the wooden bird pressed flat against her chest. Jesse stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to both of them, looking out at the last gray light falling over the snow. He stood that way for long enough that the silence got its own shape. Then he turned around. "His name was Cooper," Jesse said. "Daniel Cooper. He had gray hair and a red scarf. He'd come to our place 3 times before that night. Always polite to Mama. Always took his hat off. His voice was level, measured. The voice of someone who had rehearsed this testimony in his own head enough times to have worn the edges off it. The night he came for the last time, Aldrich was already there. They argued about money in the front room. Mama told us to stay in the back. Nora went under the bed. I went to the window because I could hear it getting bad. Caleb didn't move, didn't speak. Aldrich had a knife, Jesse said. Not a gun, a knife. He hit Cooper with something first, something from the table. And when Cooper went down, Aldrich... He stopped. 1 breath. 2. It was fast. Aldrich was fast. And then it was quiet, and Cooper wasn't moving anymore. And Aldrich looked at the door to the back room. Jesse's jaw hardened. I pulled back from the window, but I heard him. I heard him say there were children in the house, to whoever he had with him. A pause. Vane was with him. Vane said he'd handle it. But you ran before he could, Caleb said. Nora was already out from under the bed. I grabbed her, and we went out the back window. We didn't stop. Jesse looked at his sister. Something passed between them. The shared memory of that night. The cold window. The dark field. The running. We didn't stop for a long time. Nora said very quietly. He had a ring on his right hand. Aldrich. Gold with a red stone. I saw it when he was arguing with Mr. Cooper. I was looking through the crack in the door. She looked at Caleb steadily. I remember details. Jesse says I remember too many details. But I remember that one. That's not too many details, Caleb said. That's evidence. Something happened in the room then. Not loud, not visible, but real. The way pressure changed before weather shifted. The way air moved differently when something that had been holding its breath finally let it go. Jesse sat back down, not across the table this time, at the corner of it. Closer. If we testify, he said, and it doesn't work, if Aldrich's people get to a jury before the truth does, if Vane comes back with more men and the law on his side because Aldrich already has the appointment, then we deal with that when it happens, Caleb said. But I've worked a long time in rooms where men thought they were untouchable. Most of them weren't. Jesse was quiet. Then, most. Most, Caleb agreed. He didn't lie to children. He hadn't lied to anyone in 11 years of carrying a badge, and he wasn't starting now. Jesse picked up his coffee cup, both hands wrapped around it, and looked at the table. You said you stopped being a marshal because life happened. He glanced up. Does putting that badge on again mean you're starting again? Or just this once? It was the sharpest question anyone had asked Caleb in 3 years. It went somewhere specific, and it didn't apologize for it. Caleb looked at the leather case on the shelf where he'd put it the night before. 7-pointed star, Wyoming territory. Clara's Bible, 6 inches to the left of it. I don't know, he said honestly, but I know what I am right now, tonight, in this house. He looked at both of them. I'm the person standing between you and the man who wants you gone. Whatever that makes me, that's what I am. Nora uncurled from the cot and patted across the floor in her new boots. She'd put them on the moment Caleb stopped talking, as if the boots were somehow part of the same decision, and stood beside Caleb's chair. She didn't ask permission. She just rested one small hand on his forearm, the way a child did when they had run out of words, but not out of things to say. He put his hand over hers, just for a second. Then he cleared his throat and stood up to check on the broth. Jesse watched all of this. He didn't say anything, but when Caleb moved toward the stove, Jesse picked up the leather case from the shelf and turned it over in his hands, looking at the badge through the worn flap. And there was something in the way he held it. Not curious, not calculating. That was something quieter than either. Like someone holding proof that the world occasionally produced what it promised. He set it back on the shelf, exactly where it had been. I'm going to tell you everything I remember, Jesse said to Caleb's back. Every single thing. And then we're going to figure out what to do with it. Caleb stirred the broth. That's all I need. Outside, the snow had started again. Soft, steady. The kind that buried roads and muffled sound, and turned the world into a smaller, quieter version of itself. Inside, the fire held. The stove did its work. And in the Dumont boarding house, 12 miles north, a well-dressed man with cold eyes sat by a window and looked out at the dark and thought about 2 children who should have been frozen by now, and why they weren't, and what that was going to require him to do next. Jesse talked for 2 hours. He sat at the table with his coffee gone cold in front of him and his hands flat on the wood, and he went through it all, from the beginning, from before the beginning, from the fall when their mother first started coughing, and the debt to Aldrich started climbing, and the visits from Vane started coming more frequent and less polite. He talked the way someone talked when they'd been carrying something alone for so long that setting it down felt dangerous, like the weight of it had become structural, like removing it might cause something to collapse. Caleb listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't write anything down. He'd never needed to write things down. It was one of those abilities that had served him well and disturbed people who didn't understand how it worked. He simply listened, and his mind did what his mind had always done, which was to organize, to file, to find the shape of things. The shape of this thing was large. Daniel Cooper hadn't just been a debt collector. He'd been a surveyor who worked for the Territorial Land Office, the same land office that had conducted the railroad surveys, the same surveys that had made Aldrich rich. Cooper had kept records, duplicate records, Jesse said, because he hadn't trusted Aldrich even then. Records that showed exactly which parcels Aldrich had acquired before the survey results were officially released. Records that constituted fraud against the territory and 6 private landowners. Cooper had come to collect money, yes, but he'd also come with leverage. Aldrich had understood that leverage before Cooper finished explaining it. Did Cooper have those records with him? Caleb asked. That night. A case, Jesse said. Brown leather. He came in holding it. Aldrich tried to buy it off him first. I heard the number, $1,500. Cooper said no. Jesse's jaw tightened. The case was still in our front room when we ran. I don't know what happened to it. Aldrich took it, Caleb said. Not a guess. Most likely. Jesse looked up. Does it matter? If he has it, the records are gone. Or he kept them. Caleb turned his coffee cup in a slow circle. Men like Aldrich don't destroy leverage. They file it away. Because the same records that prove his fraud also prove what other people owe him. That case is somewhere. Jesse was quiet for a moment. You think like a lawman. Old habit. Is it coming back? Caleb looked at the badge on the shelf. It had been sitting there for 3 days now, ever since he'd taken it out of the trunk, and every morning he'd woken up, and it had been the first thing he'd seen, and he still hadn't answered the question it was asking. Working on it, he said. Nora had fallen asleep during Jesse's account, somewhere around the part about the red scarf. She was curled on the cot with a wooden bird tucked under her chin, breathing slow and even, finally sleeping the way a healthy child slept, deep and total and uncomplicated. Caleb had noticed that Jesse's voice had dropped slightly when she drifted off, like he'd been waiting for it, like some part of the account was for Caleb's ears only. He'd noticed that. He'd filed it. Vain, Caleb said. How many men does he usually travel with? 2 that I saw. Big men. Don't talk much. Jesse pulled at a thread in his sleeve. The same habit, Caleb had come to recognize it, as what Jesse did when he was thinking something he hadn't decided whether to say. There was a 3rd one at the fence post, younger. He's the one who tied us. A pause. He looked sorry about it. Didn't stop him. Looking sorry and being sorry are different animals. Yes, Jesse said flatly. They are. Caleb stood. He went to the window, not to look out at the view. There was nothing to see but dark and snow. But because standing helped him think, and sitting still for too long made the old restlessness surface. Vane has legal paperwork, he said. That's his angle. He comes to my door with a county welfare order and 2 large men, and the law technically on his side. If I'm just a rancher, I've got a rifle and a dead-end argument. He turned around. But if I'm a marshal... You're not a marshal, Jesse said. You said you weren't. I said I was one. There's a difference between was and can't be again. Caleb looked at the badge. My commission was never formally withdrawn. I left. That's not the same as being removed. He said it mostly to himself, working it through. I'd need to send a wire to the district office in Cheyenne. Tell them I'm back on active status. Request a formal case number for the Cooper murder and the fraud. And if they say no? They won't. Aldrich getting a territorial judgeship with a murder and a fraud case behind him is exactly the kind of thing Cheyenne wants stopped before it becomes their problem. He paused. The trick is getting the wire sent before Vane figures out where you are and makes his move. Once he shows up here with papers, the window closes. Jesse was watching him with that steady, measuring look. Then he said, So go tonight. The roads are passable. You said so yourself this morning. And if Vane's been in town a day already, he's already asking the right questions. He found us in 2 weeks with nothing to go on. He's got your name now, probably. A ranch 12 miles east of Coldwater. Jesse leaned forward. Go tonight. Send the wire. Come back. Caleb looked at the boy. 12 miles in the dark and the cold on roads that were passable but not friendly, leaving 2 children alone in a ranch house that Silas Vane was going to find sooner rather than later. He ran the calculation. There's a rifle above the door, he said. You know how to shoot. Jesse's expression said that was a very unnecessary question. Don't open the door for anyone. Not for any reason, any story, any amount of official-sounding language. You hear horses, you wake your sister, and you get behind the false wall in the pantry. 3rd board from the left. Push it at the bottom. He crossed to the shelf and took down the spare revolver, checked the cylinder, set it on the table. This, too. Jesse looked at the revolver. He picked it up the way someone picked up a tool they knew, without ceremony, without performance. He checked it the same way Caleb had, set it back down within reach. "We'll be here," he said. "I know," Caleb said. He rode hard and arrived in Coldwater just past 9 at night, when the town had gone to the particular quiet of a place that worked hard and went to bed early. The telegraph office was closed, but Caleb knew where Tom Briggs, the operator, lived, and Tom Briggs was a man who understood the difference between a closed office and an emergency. He answered his door in his long underwear and a sour expression that lasted exactly as long as it took Caleb to say the words U.S. Marshal and murder and Aldrich. The wire took 10 minutes to compose and send. Then Caleb stood in the cold outside the telegraph office and waited. Because he'd learned a long time ago that some wires got answered fast when they needed to, and this was going to be one of them.
It took 45 minutes. The answer came in 2 sentences.
Harrow, Caleb. Commission reinstated. Active status effective immediately. Cheyenne District aware of Aldrich. Proceed with extreme caution. Tom Briggs handed him the paper without a word. Then he said, "I heard there was a man at the Dumont asking about children." "You heard right. I also heard he's been talking to Franklin Ames, the county recorder." Tom's mouth flattened. Ames is the kind of man who finds out which way a thing is going, and then gets there first. Caleb folded the telegram and put it in his coat. "What did Ames tell him?" "Don't know for certain, but Ames knows this county's land records going back 20 years. And if Aldrich has been working this territory long enough to have a fraud case built up, Ames has seen the paperwork." Tom hesitated. "He might know about you, where your property sits, what road goes past it." Caleb was already moving toward his horse. "Thank you, Tom." "Caleb."
Tom's voice stopped him at the step. "You want I should send for the circuit judge? Get someone with authority out here before Aldrich's appointment goes through?"
"Yes," Caleb said. "Do that. Tell him Deputy Marshal Harrow has witnesses to a murder and a fraud case against Thomas Aldrich. Tell him it's urgent." He mounted. "And Tom, don't mention the children by name to anyone." He rode back on the south road, the way Ruth had told him to, and he rode fast. He was 3 miles out from the ranch when he saw the light. Not the warm, steady light of his stove window, the other kind, the moving kind. Lantern light, maybe 2 of them, coming from the direction of the ranch, at an angle that said they weren't inside the building. They were on the approach road. Someone was already there. Caleb pushed the horse off the road into the tree line and moved parallel, slow and quiet, closing the distance by half before he stopped and dismounted and tied the horse to a branch and went the rest of the way on foot through 6 inches of snow that tried its best to announce him with every step. 2 horses tied at his fence. 1 man standing at the door, knocking. Another man at the corner of the house, lantern raised, looking at the window. A third at the barn, checking inside. Not Vane. Not yet. These 3 were younger, rougher, the kind of men hired for tasks that required size and willingness rather than intelligence. They had the stamp of Vane's operation on them, that particular quality of men doing a job they hadn't thought too hard about. But Vane himself wasn't here, which meant Vane was smarter than that. He'd sent scouts first. The man at the door knocked again. "Hello, the house. County Welfare Office. We're looking for 2 children." He had a practiced tone, official enough to work on someone who didn't know better. "Anyone inside? We need you to open up. We have paperwork." Silence from inside. Caleb moved along the fence line, staying in the dark, getting his angle. He came up behind the man at the barn first, the one who was furthest from the others and facing away. He covered the last 10 feet in 4 long, quiet strides, and had his arm across the man's throat and his revolver against his ribs before the lantern hit the ground. "Don't," Caleb said quietly. "Don't yell. Don't move. Don't drop the other hand. Where's Vane?" The man's breathing went ragged. Where is Silas Vane?" A long moment. The man made the calculation that Caleb wanted him to make. Weight the options. Find the least painful one. "Boarding house," he gasped. "He sent us to find out if the kids were here. Come back and report. That's all. Just scout." "Who's the man at the corner of my house?" "Dunway. The one at the door is Price." "When were you supposed to report back?" "Hour, maybe 2. "And if you didn't?" The man was quiet. "He'd come himself," Caleb said. "With more men?" "Yes." Caleb stepped back and brought the revolver down hard and fast at the base of the man's skull. Not enough to do lasting damage, enough to end the conversation. He caught the man before he dropped and set him down against the barn wall and took his gun and his knife and his belt for good measure. Price at the door and Dunway at the window were easier. They were still knocking, still watching for movement inside, still operating on the assumption that they were alone. Caleb came around the corner of the house from the blind side, put both men on the ground inside of 30 seconds, tied them with their own belts, and left them in the snow with considerably less dignity than they'd arrived with. He stood at his own front door and knocked twice. Then once, then twice again. The pattern he'd told Jesse about before he left. The one he'd invented on the ride to town because some instinct had been whispering to him all day that the night was going to require it. A long pause, then the sound of the bar lifting. Jesse opened the door with the revolver in his hand, barrel up, finger outside the trigger guard. Proper, careful, exactly right. His face was white, but his hands were steady. Behind him, Nora stood at the edge of the pantry doorway, wrapped in a blanket, the wooden bird gripped in both hands. She'd made it to the pantry on her own. He hadn't told her to. She'd heard the horses, and she'd done it herself. 3 of them, Caleb said, stepping inside. "They're outside, tied." He looked at Jesse. "You all right?" "We heard them come," Jesse said. "We did what you said." "I know. You did right." Caleb took the revolver from Jesse's hand, gently, no hurry, and set it on the table. "Vane didn't come himself. He's still at the boarding house." "He will now," Jesse said, "when those 3 don't come back." "Yes." Caleb put the telegram on the table. Jesse looked at it, read it again. His brow furrowed. "That means you're Marshal again, as of 45 minutes ago." Caleb looked at both of them, which changes what Vane can do legally. "He comes to my door now. He's not coming to a private citizen's property. He's coming to a federal officer's property, to interfere with protected witnesses in an active federal case." He paused. "That doesn't make him less dangerous. It makes him more careful. And careful men make different mistakes than reckless ones." Jesse set the telegram down slowly. "You did that tonight. For us. I did that tonight because it was the right move. And because—" Caleb stopped. He looked at Jesse, then at Nora, who had come fully into the room now and was standing 3 feet away, watching him with those dark, steady eyes. "Because when I put that badge in the drawer 3 years ago, I told myself I was done, that nothing was worth the cost anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "Turns out I was wrong about what nothing looked like." Nora crossed the 3 feet without ceremony and put her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his coat. Caleb stood very still. His hands came up slowly and rested on her shoulders, careful and deliberate, the way you held something you were afraid of dropping. Jesse looked away. He went to the window. He stood there with his back to both of them, looking out at the dark where the 3 tied men we're learning something about the temperature of Wyoming nights. And his shoulders rose once and fell, and something that had been held rigid in him since before the fence post, and before the running, and maybe before their mother died in October, settled, just slightly, into a different position. "What happens now?" he said. "I take those 3 into town at first light. Deposit them with a local constable, with a formal complaint under federal authority." Caleb stepped back from Nora. She let him go without protest, just looked up and then went to sit by the fire. That creates a record, a public one. Vane making a move after that gets a lot more complicated for him. He'll still make it. Yes, but he'll have to think first.
And while he's thinking, Ruth Calloway is putting together the kind of quiet community pressure that doesn't show up in official records, but makes things very difficult for men who need cooperation to operate. He sat down at the table. And the circuit judge is on his way from Cheyenne. Jesse turned from the window. "How long?"
3 days, maybe 4, depending on the roads.
"A lot can happen in 4 days."
"Yes," Caleb said. He didn't dress it up. "But a lot already has." He looked at Jesse steadily. 2 weeks ago, you were running. Tonight, you're in a warm house with a federal case behind you and a marshal who's not going anywhere. He let that land. That's different. That's real. Jesse looked at him for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from Caleb and sat down. He picked up his cold coffee and drank it anyway, grimaced, set it down. "I'm going to need to testify," Jesse said. "In front of a judge." "Yes." "Nora, too." "Probably."
The ring detail she remembered. That's the kind of specific physical evidence that holds up. A 7-year-old girl describing a gold ring with a red stone that puts Aldrich at the scene. Caleb shook his head slowly. "That's not nothing, Jesse. That's exactly the kind of thing that convinces people." Jesse's jaw worked. He looked over at his sister, who had fallen asleep again against the arm of the chair, the wooden bird still in her lap, firelight moving soft across her face. "She's 7, he said. "She's been through enough." "I know." Caleb kept his voice level. "I won't put her in front of anyone without your say-so. Or hers. She gets to decide too." Jesse looked at him sharply, like the idea that Nora got a decision in the matter was something that required recalibration. Then his expression shifted, something wry and tired and deeply familiar moving across his face. "She'll want to," he said. "She'll say yes before you finish asking. That's how she is." He shook his head. "She's not scared of anything. She should be, and she's not." "She's scared," Caleb said quietly. "She's just decided not to lead with it." Jesse was still for a moment. Then, very quietly, he said, "That's what Mama used to say about her." The fire cracked between them. Outside the wind had come up again, low and steady, the kind that settled in for the night and made the walls feel more solid by contrast. Caleb watched the boy across the table, this hollow-cheeked, careful, fiercely guarded boy who had stood over his sister with a broken stick, and then sat across from a stranger and given his testimony, and checked a revolver, and opened a door in the dark with steady hands, and thought about what it cost to become that kind of person at 9 years old. What it took from you, what it left behind. "Get some sleep," Caleb said. "Tomorrow's going to be early and cold and complicated." Jesse stood. He went to his place on the floor beside the cot, pulled his blanket around him, settled with his back against the wall. Old habit, old position. But something was different about it now. He wasn't watching the door with both eyes open. He was watching the fire. "Caleb," Jesse said in the dark, not quite a question. "Yeah?" A pause. "The badge." Another pause. "Does it feel different, putting it back on?" Caleb looked at the shelf,
at the leather case and Clara's Bible standing together in the firelight. "Yes," he said. "Different how?" Caleb thought about it honestly, about the wire and Tom Briggs' sour expression, and riding back through the dark with a telegram in his pocket, and hitting the first man at the barn with a clarity and a purpose that had been absent from his hands for 3 long years. About the way the house had looked, with light in the windows, when he'd come back across the snow. "Like I remembered what it was for," he said. Jesse was quiet for a moment. Then he closed his eyes. Nora slept in her chair. The fire held against the dark. Somewhere 12 miles north, in a boarding house room with a lamp still burning, Silas Vane was waiting for 3 men who were not going to come back, and beginning to understand that the problem he'd been sent to handle quietly had just become something considerably larger. The 3 men spent the night tied to Caleb's fence post. He didn't feel particularly sorry about it. He'd left them their coats and checked on them once before midnight to confirm they were cold and miserable, but not in any genuine danger, which was considerably more consideration than they'd extended to 2 children a week earlier. By the time he brought them in at first light, hands bound, walking single file, deeply unhappy about the temperature, they had developed the cooperative attitude that a Wyoming night in January tended to produce in men who had time to think. The constable in Coldwater was a man named Earl Briggs, Tom's younger brother, who shared his siblings' talent for grasping situations quickly and his preference for handling them without drama. He listened to Caleb's account, looked at the telegram establishing federal authority, looked at the 3 men, and said, "I'll hold them on trespassing and threatening behavior, pending the circuit judge." Then he paused. "Aldrich is going to hear about this before noon." "I know," Caleb said. "He's got friends in this town." "I know that too." Caleb settled his hat. "He's also got enemies. They've been quieter, but there are more of them." He thought of Ruth Calloway straightening tins that didn't need straightening. Let the friends talk. Loud people in small rooms don't change what's in a federal case file. Earl looked at him for a long moment. "You're really back on." "Apparently." "Huh." Earl processed this. "Well, all right then." He reached under the counter and set something on the wood between them. An old deputy star, smaller than Caleb's Marshal badge, bent slightly along one point. "Belonged to my predecessor. Man retired to Laramie 3 years ago and left this behind. I can't deputize you federal, but if you want a local authority to back the federal one, keep it," Caleb said. "I've got enough metal." He turned for the door. "Send word when the circuit judge arrives." He was back at the ranch by mid-morning. Jesse had made breakfast. Not elaborately, oats and salt and some of the dried apples from the pantry. But he'd made it, which was the point. He'd found the pot and the right proportions, and he'd done it without being asked. And when Caleb came through the door, Jesse set a bowl on the table with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone claiming a small piece of usefulness. Caleb sat down and ate without comment. Then he said, "It's good." Jesse sat across from him. "It's oats, good oats." Nora was at the window, standing on the bottom rail of the chair to get the extra height, watching snowfall with her chin propped on the sill. She'd been doing this every morning, watching it like it was something she was keeping an eye on, rather than something that frightened her, which Caleb figured was its own kind of progress. "He knows by now," Jesse said. "Yes, and he knows I'm back on federal commission, which means his legal maneuver with the welfare papers doesn't work the way he planned it. Can't walk into a federal officer's home and demand handover of protected witnesses with a county document." Caleb pushed the empty bowl aside. So he adjusts. To what? To one of 2 things. Either he moves through official channels, tries to get someone in Cheyenne to slow down the circuit judge, calls in whatever favors he has at the territory level, or he stops being official entirely. Caleb looked at Jesse steadily. Vane's a careful man. He'll try the official route first. That buys us 2 days, maybe 3. And if it doesn't work for him, then he comes himself, with enough men that careful stops mattering. Jesse's jaw set. It was a particular expression Caleb had come to recognize. Not fear, exactly, but the tightening of someone who had learned that bad things coming didn't mean you got to fall apart about it. So we used the 2 days. We used the 2 days, Caleb agreed. I need your testimony written down. Formal, signed, witnessed. And Nora's too, if she's willing. He looked over at the girl at the window. Speaking of which, Nora turned from the window. She had apparently been listening to the entire conversation with one ear while watching the snow with both eyes, which Caleb was learning was simply how she operated. I'm willing, she said. Jesse looked at her. You don't know what you're agreeing to yet. I heard enough. She climbed down from the chair and came to the table and sat in the third chair, the one that had been an unused piece of furniture 2 weeks ago and was now simply hers. I want to say what I saw. I've been wanting to say it since it happened. She looked at Caleb. What do I have to do? You tell me exactly what you remember. I write it down. You sign your name at the bottom. He paused. It goes to the circuit judge as evidence. He may want to ask you questions himself when he arrives. Okay, Nora said. It might be hard. Some of the questions will be about the night Mr. Cooper died. Nora looked at her hands. For just a moment, something moved across her face. The shadow of that night, the under-the-bed darkness and the sounds from the front room, and the cold window she and Jesse had gone through running. Then she lifted her chin. I know what I saw, she said. A ring. Gold. Red stone. His right hand. He was pointing at Mr. Cooper when he had it on. She looked up at Caleb. I'm not going to forget it. No, Caleb said. I don't expect you are. He spent the morning taking their statements, writing them out longhand in the careful, deliberate print he'd used for 11 years of case files. Jesse's account ran to 4 pages, detailed, specific, ordered chronologically with the precision of a boy who had clearly been organizing it in his own mind for weeks, waiting for someone who deserved to hear it. Nora's was shorter, but contained 3 details that Jesse hadn't seen. The ring, the color of the case Cooper carried, and the words Aldrich had said to Vane afterward, spoken low, but not low enough for a child under a bed in a quiet house. Make sure there's nothing left to find. When Caleb read that line back to her to confirm it, Nora nodded once. That's what he said, she said. I practiced it so I wouldn't forget. Jesse looked at his sister with something complicated and tired and deeply proud. He didn't say anything. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers for 3 seconds. She turned her palm up and squeezed back. Caleb witnessed both documents, signed and dated them, and put them in the inside pocket of his coat next to the telegram. Ruth Calloway arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She came in a wagon with her neighbor's son driving and a crate in the back that turned out to contain, in no particular order, a smoked ham, 2 jars of preserved peaches, a wool blanket in a blue pattern, a children's primer that had belonged to Ruth's daughter 20 years ago, and a cast-iron skillet Ruth had determined Caleb's kitchen was lacking. She came inside, took off her coat, looked at Jesse and Nora with the direct, appraising gaze of a woman who had raised 4 children of her own and knew the difference between children who were surviving and children who were going to be all right. She looked at them for about 5 seconds. Then she said, You both look better than I expected. She set the primer on the table in front of Nora. Do you read? Nora's eyes went to the book and lit up the way they had with the peppermint sticks. Some, she said. We'll work on the rest. Ruth sat down, folded her hands, and looked at Caleb with the directness of a woman who had come with a purpose and intended to get to it. Franklin Ames left town this morning, before dawn, took his horse and one bag. Caleb went still. He ran. Cleaned out his desk at the county recorder's office, according to Doris Hale, who works in the building next door and notices things. Ruth's voice was flat and informational. Which means one of two things. Either Vane reached him last night and told him to disappear the records and get out before the circuit judge arrived, or Ames got nervous about which way this was going and decided to protect himself. She paused. Either way, the county records for the land transfers go with him. Not all of them, Caleb said. He thought about Cooper's case, the brown leather case, the duplicate records. Ames was the county recorder, but Cooper was a territorial surveyor. His records were filed at two levels, county and territorial. Ames could clean out the county office, but the territorial archive in Cheyenne is out of his reach. Ruth looked at him steadily. You already thought of that. Tom Briggs sent a second wire for me last night. Cheyenne's been asked to secure the territorial survey records under federal hold pending the case. He sat down across from her. What else? Aldrich left his office in town 3 hours ago, took his personal secretary and his horse. Ruth said it the way she said everything, plainly, without drama, letting the fact carry its own weight. He's not at the boarding house. Vane was seen this morning purchasing provisions at the hardware, enough for several men, several days. Jesse, who had been listening from the other side of the room, with the wooden bird turning in his fingers, Nora had apparently lent it to him at some point, the way she redistributed things she considered comfort without being asked, looked up sharply. He's not leaving. No, Caleb said. He's not leaving. He's going to come here. He's going to come here, Caleb confirmed. The question is when and how many men he brings. Then we need more people, Jesse said. The flatness in his voice was something different from its usual caution. It was tactical. A 9-year-old boy doing math about the only resource that mattered. You can't hold off however many men Vane brings with one rifle and one revolver. Ruth Calloway smiled. It was a small smile, brief, but it had satisfaction in it. I mentioned that to 6 families in town this morning, she said. Men who had dealings with Aldrich over the land surveys. Men who sold parcels they were told were worth nothing, and found out later the railroad paid 10 times that amount to whoever bought them next. She straightened the blanket on the crate. I told them a federal marshal had active witnesses and an active case and was expecting trouble at his ranch in the next 48 hours. Caleb looked at her. I was told, Ruth continued, that I should let you know that 8 men intend to be here by tomorrow morning. They're bringing their own guns and enough provisions for 3 days. She folded her hands again. I told them they'd have to ask you. This is your operation. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He thought about asking whether Ruth had considered the risk she'd put those 8 men in. Then he looked at her face and decided that Ruth Calloway had been calculating risk since 1869 and didn't need the reminder. Tell them to come in from the South Road, he said. Staggered, not together. I don't want it to look like an armed gathering from a distance. He paused. And Ruth, thank you. Don't thank me. I've been waiting 11 years for someone to build a case against Thomas Aldrich. She stood, put her coat back on with brisk efficiency. He's the reason my husband's partner lost his land in 1871 and drank himself to death in 1873. I have personal reasons. She looked at Jesse and Nora. You did right, she told Jesse, protecting her all that time. That's not a small thing. Jesse looked at her with a flash of surprise, the unguarded look of someone who hadn't expected to be seen clearly. He nodded once, tight, without words. Nora was already opening the primer. The afternoon was spent in preparation and waiting, which Caleb had always found to be the hardest combination. Action he could manage. Sitting still with the knowledge of what was coming was a different discipline.
He checked the rifle, checked the revolver, checked his sight lines from the windows and the angles on the approach road. He moved the documents to the strongbox under the floorboards in the back room, the one he'd built for Clara's jewelry and never opened anymore. Safe, dry, bolted. Evidence preserved, regardless of what happened to the man carrying it. Jesse helped without being asked. Not underfoot, not in the way. He appeared at Caleb's elbow at the right moments and did the right things, as if he'd been reading the operation the way he read everything, by watching long enough to understand the pattern. He held things when Caleb needed them held. He moved when Caleb needed the space. He didn't ask questions that weren't necessary. At one point, moving a heavy chair to reinforce the front door, Jesse lost his grip on his end, and the chair scraped hard against the wall, and he flinched. Fast, involuntary. The kind of flinch that had nothing to do with the chair. Caleb saw it. Didn't react. But after they set the chair in place, he said, without looking directly at Jesse, "You don't have to be anywhere near the action tomorrow. You and Nora stay in the back room regardless." Jesse's jaw tightened. "I can help." "You are helping. You'll help more by keeping your sister safe and keeping those documents safe. That's the job." He met Jesse's eyes. "The documents are the whole case. Without them, and without your testimony, this is just one man's word against Aldrich's connections. You're more important to this than a rifle." Jesse processed this. The logic worked on him the way logic did. He couldn't argue with it, but he wanted to. "I'm not hiding," he said. "You're protecting the evidence." Caleb held his gaze. "That's not the same thing." Jesse looked away. Then, "Fine." "Fine," Caleb said. Nora cooked dinner, or she tried to. She sat at the table directing Jesse through it, with the primer open beside her and her finger on a word she was sounding out between instructions, managing two things at once with the breezy confidence of someone who saw no reason they couldn't be handled simultaneously. The ham Ruth had brought. The last of the potatoes. It came out uneven and slightly oversalted, and Caleb ate 2 full plates of it. "How is it?" Nora asked, watching him. "Best thing I've eaten in a week," Caleb said. She beamed. Jesse rolled his eyes. "It's too salty," Jesse said. "It's a little salty," Caleb said. "That's different." "It's basically the same." "No, it isn't." Jesse looked at Caleb across the table, with an expression that was fighting itself, the wanting not to, and the doing it anyway. And then something cracked through it, brief and real, and years too young for the face it lived on. The corner of his mouth pulled up. Half a second. Gone. Caleb pretended not to notice. He took a third bite. After dinner, after Nora fell asleep over the primer with her head on the table, and had to be moved to the cot, Caleb and Jesse sat by the fire in the way they'd been sitting for days now. Close enough to talk, far enough to give each other space. The particular comfortable distance of two people who have found a working arrangement. Jesse said, "What happens if the circuit judge doesn't make it in time?" "We hold until he does." "With 8 farmers. 8 men with land grievances and rifles," Caleb said. "Don't underestimate what a man will do when he's protecting something that was taken from him." He looked at the fire. "Vane knows I'm a federal marshal now. He knows there are witnesses, signed documents, a case in progress. Any move he makes against this property is a federal crime. That changes his calculation." "Unless Aldrich decides the risk is worth it," Jesse said. "If we testify, he loses everything. The judgeship, the land, the money, his freedom. Men with everything to lose do things that don't calculate. Yes, Caleb said, they do. Jesse was quiet for a while. He turned the wooden bird in his fingers the way he'd been doing all day, a slow rotation, thinking with his hands. Nora's going to wake up tomorrow morning and want to do something useful, he said. She'll want to help. Then let her help, Caleb said, within reason. She'll define reason differently than you do. I've noticed. Caleb looked at the boy. Jesse, whatever happens tomorrow, you've already done the hardest part. You kept her alive through 2 weeks of running and a fence post in 20 below. Tomorrow is just the next thing. Jesse looked down at the bird. He set it on the arm of the chair between them, exactly in the middle, Caleb noticed, the space where neither of them was sitting. She gave me this, Jesse said, about an hour ago. Said I could borrow it for tonight because it helped. He paused. She does that. Just gives you the thing that helps, without making the thing of it. She's something, Caleb said quietly. She's everything, Jesse said. Plain and factual, the same voice he used for all the true things. The fire settled into its low nighttime work. The wind moved around the house, testing its arguments. Outside, a mile away, a single rider came down the south road in the dark and tied his horse at the fence quietly and settled in at the barn without announcement. The first of the 8 arrived early, apparently unable to wait. Caleb saw the lamp signal from the barn window, the 3-flash agreed code he'd sent with Ruth, and felt something settle in his own chest. He went to the shelf. He took down the leather case and opened it and unpinned the badge and turned it in his fingers once. Deputy U.S. Marshal, Wyoming Territory. He'd worn it for 11 years and taken it off like putting down a language he decided not to speak anymore. He looked at it now in the firelight and thought about Clara, who had known what he was and loved him for it, and also understood what it cost. Who had said once, toward the end, when he'd been sitting beside her and she'd had one of her clear moments and used it to say the thing that mattered, "Don't let grief make you small, Caleb. You were built for more than a fence line." He pinned the badge to his coat. Jesse saw. He didn't say anything. He just watched, and something in his face settled into the particular quiet of a thing resolved. "Get some sleep," Caleb said. "Tomorrow comes early." Jesse looked at him, at the badge, at his face, at whatever it was he'd been reading and weighing and calculating since the fence post, and gave a single nod. He went to his place on the floor, pulled his blanket around him. He lay with his back no longer against the wall. He was facing the fire. Caleb sat up in his chair through the first part of the night, watching the road, listening to the dark. By midnight, 3 more riders had come down the south road and found their places quietly, the way men moved when they were serious about a thing and didn't need to be loud about it. By 2 in the morning, the barn held 4 armed men, and the house held a federal marshal and 2 children who had already survived everything winter had thrown at them. By morning, Silas Vane was going to have to make a decision. And somewhere on the frozen road between the Dumont boarding house and a ranch 12 miles east of Coldwater, that decision was already in motion. Dawn came in gray and cold and certain. Caleb was already up when the light changed. He'd slept in the chair in 2-hour stretches, the old Marshal's sleep, light enough to hear anything and deep enough to be useful. He built the fire up before the children stirred, put coffee on, stood at the window and watched the south road come visible out of the dark, inch by inch, the way roads did in winter mornings, reluctantly, as if they'd rather stay hidden. The barn lamp signaled at first light. 5 flashes. All 8 men were in position. Caleb signaled back. He heard Jesse wake behind him, not the gradual surface of ordinary sleep, but the fast, clean break of someone who had trained themselves to come alert without transition. The boy sat up,
looked at the window, looked at Caleb, asked nothing, understood everything. "Nora still sleeping?" Caleb said quietly. Jesse checked. "Yes." "Let her." Jesse stood, folded his blanket with a neat automatic motion of someone who had learned that order in small things was the only order you could guarantee. He came to stand beside Caleb at the window. They stood there together looking at the road, the two of them, and Caleb thought that a month ago this window had framed nothing but empty land and his own reflection, and the particular silence of a man who had stopped expecting anything to happen. Now it framed something entirely different. "They'll come from the North Road," Jesse said. "Yes, coming south from town, they'd take the north approach. It's faster." "Will they know about the men in the barn?" "No way to know that." Caleb picked up his coffee. "But Vane's careful. He'll assume I'm not alone. He'll come with enough men to handle whatever he imagines." He paused. "The question isn't how many he brings. The question is whether he comes to negotiate or to end it." Jesse was quiet for a moment. "He can't negotiate. There's nothing left to offer." "Right. So he comes to end it." "So he comes to end it," Caleb said. "And we make sure that costs more than he's willing to pay." They didn't have to wait long. An hour after full light, while Nora was eating oats at the table with the primer open beside her bowl, she'd apparently decided that breakfast and reading could coexist without anyone's permission. Jesse said, from the window, "North Road." Caleb set down his coffee. 7 riders. He counted them as they came down the approach at a walk, no hurry, the particular unhurried pace of men who had decided they had all the advantages and wanted you to know it. Vane was in front. Caleb recognized him from Jesse's description. Well-dressed, even for this. Long, dark coat, hat level. The posture of a man accustomed to arriving places and having them rearrange themselves around him. Thomas Aldrich rode beside him. Caleb hadn't expected that. He stood at the window and looked at the man whose name had been in his case file 3 years ago and never made it to an arrest. Heavy-set, gray at the temples, a face that had learned to look reasonable and had practiced it until it was automatic. A gold ring on his right hand. Caleb could see it from the window, catching the morning light. He heard Nora set down her spoon. He turned. She was looking past him at the riders, her face very still, very quiet. Her hand had found the wooden bird on the table and closed around it without her seeming to notice. Jesse had moved to stand between her and the window. Instinct old and immediate. "Back room," Caleb said. "Both of you. Documents stay in the strongbox. You don't come out until I come for you, or until Earl Briggs walks through that door. Nobody else." Jesse put his hand on Nora's shoulder. She was still looking at the riders. At Aldrich, specifically. Then she looked at Caleb, and her face did something complicated and final. The face of someone who has been waiting a long time for a thing to be over and can finally see the edge of it. "Be careful," she said. "Always," Caleb said. Jesse moved her toward the back room. At the doorway, he stopped and looked back once. At Caleb, at the badge on his coat, at the rifle in Caleb's hand. His jaw was set. His eyes were clear. He gave one nod, short and certain, and then the door closed. Caleb walked to his front door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch. Vane pulled up 15 feet away. His 6 men spread out in a loose arc behind him, the practiced spread of men who knew how to fill space with intention. Aldrich stayed slightly back, which told Caleb everything about which man was actually in charge of his own nerve. "Marshal Harrow," Vane said. He said the word Marshal the way a man said a word he'd just learned and wasn't yet sure how much weight it deserved. "I was hoping we could handle this as professionals." You've got an interesting definition of professional, Caleb said. 3 of your men spent the night tied to a fence post. A misunderstanding.
Trespassing and threatening behavior under federal jurisdiction isn't a misunderstanding. It's a charge. Caleb kept his voice level and his rifle loose in his hands and his eyes moving across all 7 men without settling on any one of them. Same as whatever you're here to do this morning. We're here for the children, Aldrich said. He rode forward a step, apparently deciding that staying behind Vane looked worse than it felt. He had the practiced authority of a man who had been using his voice as a weapon for decades, and it showed. 2 orphaned minors in the custody of a private citizen without legal standing. Federal Marshal, Caleb said. That's not private. Your reinstatement is pending review. My reinstatement is confirmed by wire from the Cheyenne District Office. I've got the paper in my pocket. You want to see it, or are we going to keep pretending there's a version of this morning where you ride away with those children? Aldrich's jaw tightened. Something moved in his face, the reasonable expression cracking just slightly at the edges, the thing underneath it not reasonable at all. His right hand moved, the gold ring catching the light, and Caleb thought about Nora in that back room, with her hand around the wooden bird and her testimony in the strongbox under the floor, and her voice saying, "I know what I saw." "Those children are witnesses to a fabricated account," Aldrich said. "Whatever they told you, they told me about Daniel Cooper," Caleb said. "They told me about a brown leather case with survey records in it. They told me about a gold ring with a red stone." He watched Aldrich's face. "They told me exactly what happened in that house in October. Both of them. Under oath. Witnessed and filed." He paused. "The circuit judge from Cheyenne is 2 days out. He has copies. The Territorial Archive in Cheyenne has the survey records under federal hold." He let that land. "There's no version of this where making those children disappear makes the case disappear. That window closed 3 days ago." Silence. The wind moved between them. Vane's expression hadn't changed. He was still watching Caleb with the flat professional attention of a man running calculations. But his right hand had shifted on the reins. Caleb saw it. He also saw the barn door, 15 feet to his left and slightly behind him, ease open by 3 inches. Aldrich said, "You have no idea what you're—" And that was when Vane moved. Not toward Caleb, toward Aldrich. Fast and without hesitation, the move of a man who had just finished his own calculation and arrived at a result that surprised even himself. He put his horse between Aldrich and the barn, dropped from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, and raised both hands. "I'm done," he said. Every man on that porch and in that yard went still. Aldrich stared at him. "What?" "I said I'm done." Vane's voice was flat. He didn't look at Aldrich. He looked at Caleb. "Whatever deal you're offering for cooperation, Marshal, I want to hear it." "Vane," Aldrich said, and the reasonable voice was entirely gone now, replaced by something that had never needed to be reasonable before, because it had always had enough money to be something else. "Vane, what are you—" "He's got a federal case with 2 witnesses and a paper trail that goes to Cheyenne," Vane said, still to Caleb. "You told me Cooper was a loose end. You didn't tell me there were children in the house. You didn't tell me what Cooper was actually carrying." His jaw worked. "I'm not hanging for a murder I didn't commit, because you couldn't close your own loose ends." The barn door opened all the way. 8 men came out with rifles. Aldrich's 6 riders looked at the barn, looked at each other, looked at the rifles, and made the calculation that men made when the numbers stopped working in their favor. Hands came up, one at a time. The reluctant surrender of people who had been hired for a simpler job than this one had become. Aldrich sat on his horse alone.
He looked at Vane with an expression that had moved past fury into something colder and more personal. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he looked at the 8 men with rifles. He was doing what men like him always did in the final moment, looking for the angle, looking for the play, looking for the thing he'd missed that he could still use. There wasn't one. The look on his face when he understood that was something Caleb had seen before, across 11 years of arrests. And it never looked the same twice, but it always meant the same thing. The moment a man understood that the story he'd been telling about himself wasn't going to hold anymore. "Get down," Caleb said. Aldrich got down. It took the better part of the morning to secure everyone and get the official accounting done. Earl Briggs arrived within the hour. Ruth had sent for him before dawn, apparently, which meant Ruth had anticipated the timeline with a precision that continued to impress. And the formal arrest of Thomas Aldrich on charges of murder, land fraud, and conspiracy went into the record with the quiet, paper-heavy finality of a thing that had been a long time coming. Vane agreed to a full cooperative statement in exchange for a lesser charge. He sat at Caleb's table for 2 hours with Earl Briggs across from him and talked, and what came out of that 2 hours was a complete accounting of Aldrich's land scheme going back 9 years. The surveys, the bribes, the men who'd sold land at a loss not knowing the railroad was coming, the names of county officials who'd taken money to look the other way. Franklin Ames, it turned out, had not gotten far. He'd made it 40 miles down the Laramie Road before the cold and his own poor planning had persuaded him to turn back. He was picked up before noon. Caleb went to the back room when it was over. He knocked. 2 knocks, pause, 1 knock. The signal he'd given Jesse that morning. A moment of silence, then the sound of the board shifting, and the door opened, and Jesse stood there with the revolver still in his hand, and Nora pressed against his side with her hand in his. They both looked at Caleb's face. They were good at reading faces, both of them. Had learned it the hard way, and learned it well. Nora said, "It's done." "It's done," Caleb said. She came out of the room first. She walked past Caleb and stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at Earl Briggs with his paperwork, and the men moving in and out of the house, and the absence of Silas Vane and Thomas Aldrich, and the general organized aftermath of a thing resolved. Then she turned around and walked back to Caleb and hugged him around the middle with both arms and her face pressed hard against his coat, the way she did when she had a great deal to say and had decided that none of it was going to be words. He held on. Jesse stayed in the doorway. He was still holding the revolver, not pointed at anything, just held. He looked at the room, at the papers on the table, at the badge on Caleb's coat visible above Nora's head. Then he crossed to the table and set the revolver down, with a deliberateness that said something about the laying down of weights. "Aldrich," he said, "in custody. Earl Briggs has him. He goes to Cheyenne when the circuit judge arrives." Caleb looked at Jesse over Nora's head. "Vane is cooperating. Full statement. What he gave us this morning fills in every gap in your testimony." He paused. "It's a complete case, Jesse. It's going to hold." Jesse's face moved through several things quickly and privately. Then he sat down in his chair, the corner of the table, the spot that had become his, and put both hands flat on the wood and looked at them. "Cooper," he said. "Daniel Cooper. There'll be a proper inquest. Aldrich will be charged formally. Cooper's family, if he has any, will be notified." Caleb stepped back from Nora. She let go without protest, looked up, went to find the primer. What happened to him will be on the official record, under his name. Jesse nodded slowly. "Good," he said. He took his hat off for Mama every time he came. He deserved better than what happened to him. "Yes," Caleb said. "He did." Ruth Calloway arrived that afternoon, as if she had been waiting precisely the right amount of time before appearing, which, knowing Ruth, she probably had.
She came in, assessed the situation, declared the kitchen insufficient for the number of people she intended to feed, and proceeded to cook a meal large enough for everyone who had come down the South Road that morning with a rifle and stayed to see the thing through. The house that evening held more people than it had held since Clara was alive. Men Caleb hadn't spoken to properly in 3 years sat at his table and ate and talked, and somewhere in the middle of that noise and warmth, something in the walls of the house seemed to remember what it was built for. Nora moved through it with the unself-conscious ease of a child who had decided she belonged somewhere and was simply acting accordingly. She refilled coffee cups without being asked. She answered questions about herself with the direct brevity she applied to everything. She made one man laugh so hard he choked on his biscuit, which she found extremely satisfying. Jesse sat beside Caleb through most of it, not pressed close, not leaning, just there. The proximity of someone who had made a decision about where they stood and had stopped negotiating with themselves about it. At some point, Ruth put a plate in front of Caleb that he hadn't asked for and said, quietly, beside his ear, "Circuit judge sent a second wire. 3 days. He's bringing someone from the territorial family court." Caleb looked at her. "Formal guardianship," Ruth said. "Just that." Then she went back to the stove. He thought about it through dinner and through the gradual departure of the 8 men and through the cleanup after and through the hour when the house quieted down to its 3 usual inhabitants and the fire settled and the snow outside did its slow, patient work on the world. He was still thinking about it when Nora fell asleep in the chair with the primer on her lap and the wooden bird in her hand, asleep between one page and the next, the way 7-year-olds dropped into sleep, completely and without warning. Jesse was at the table, turning his coffee cup. He'd been quiet for an hour, which was sometimes how Jesse processed things, and sometimes how he built up to saying them. Caleb had learned to wait. "The family court," Jesse said. "You heard." "I hear most things." He turned the cup. "What does that mean? For us?" Caleb looked at the fire. He thought about what it meant with the same honesty he'd applied to every question these children had asked him, because they deserved that, had always deserved that, had been lied to and maneuvered and dismissed enough times that the least he could give them was the truth straight. "It means, if I ask," he said carefully, "and if you both agree, it could mean something official, legal." He looked at Jesse. "It could mean this is your home, permanent. Not charity, not temporary, not until something better comes along." He paused. "Your home, my home, the same one." Jesse looked at the table. A long time passed. Long enough that the fire shifted and settled. Long enough that Nora murmured something in her sleep, and Jesse glanced at her automatically, checking, the way he always checked, the way he would probably always check for the rest of his life. "She already thinks it's her home," Jesse said finally. "I know. She decided that about 4 days in." A pause. "She told me. Said it felt like the place she was supposed to end up." He looked up. "Nora doesn't say things she doesn't mean." "No," Caleb said. "She doesn't." Jesse was quiet again. He looked at his hands, at the table, at the fire, at his sister sleeping in the chair with the wooden bird, the one Caleb had given her, the one she'd lent to Jesse last night and then quietly reclaimed this morning without anyone making a thing of it. "I don't trust easy," Jesse said. "I know. I might not for a long time. I might be difficult about things. Ask questions you don't think need asking. I'll probably check the exits in every room we ever go into for the rest of my life. I don't know how to stop doing that."
He said it plainly, like a man laying out the terms of a contract, honest about the fine print. I'm telling you that now, so you know what you're actually agreeing to. Caleb looked at this boy, this 9-year-old, this impossible, fierce, careful, exhausted, loyal, brilliant boy who had stood over his sister with a broken stick in 20 below zero and given his testimony for 2 hours straight, and loaded a revolver with steady hands and nodded at a marshal's badge like it was a promise he intended to hold someone to. "Jesse," he said, "I spent 11 years taking statements from people in the worst moments of their lives. I know the difference between a person who tells you who they are and a person who tells you what they think you want to hear." He held the boy's gaze. "You've been telling me who you are since the fence post. I already agreed to it." Jesse's throat moved. He looked down at the table. Then he looked up and said, very quietly, with the directness he reserved for things that cost him something to say, "Okay." Just that. One word. But it had the weight of everything he'd carried since October in it. Everything he'd protected, and everything he'd lost. And everything he'd refused to put down, even when putting it down would have been easier. It had Nora in it, and their mother, and the fence post, and the cold, and the running, and the testimony, and 8 men from town who came down a south road before dawn with rifles because it was right, and a woman who brought a smoked ham and a children's primer and didn't call it anything. It had all of it in one word. "Okay," Caleb said back. The circuit judge arrived on the 3rd day, as promised. He was a compact, no-nonsense man from Cheyenne named Aldrich Fry, who had seen enough frontier justice and injustice in 20 years on the circuit to know the difference between a case that was solid and one that was dressed to look it. He reviewed the testimony, reviewed the survey records under federal hold, reviewed Vane's cooperative statement, and told Caleb in plain language that Thomas Aldrich was going to spend the foreseeable future wishing he had made different choices in October. The family court representative was a woman named Margaret Holt, who wore a gray coat and asked Jesse and Nora questions in the direct, respectful way of someone who understood that children were people and that people deserved to be asked rather than decided for. She spoke to Jesse alone for 20 minutes. She spoke to Nora alone for 10 minutes, after which Nora apparently told her that she'd already made her decision and had made it several weeks ago and was mainly waiting for the adults to catch up. Margaret Holt had found this either charming or alarming. Caleb wasn't entirely sure which, but she'd signed the paperwork either way. He signed it at the kitchen table with Jesse standing beside him and Nora standing beside Jesse, and Ruth Calloway sitting across from him as the legal witness, her hands folded, her expression containing the specific satisfaction of a woman who had arranged for this to happen and was now watching it happen and found the result acceptable. The pen was Clara's. He'd found it in the same drawer as the badge. When it was done, Nora picked up the paper and looked at her name on it. Nora Harrow, written in her own careful, deliberate hand. The letter she'd been practicing in the primer for a week. And her face did something that Caleb was going to remember for the rest of his life. Something that had nothing to do with relief or triumph, and everything to do with the simple, staggering fact of being claimed, of belonging to something, of having a name that meant you were accounted for, that someone would notice your absence, that you were someone's, and they were yours. She set the paper down. She looked at Jesse. He had his name on the paper too, Jesse Harrow, and he was looking at it with the same expression he wore when something reached past his careful armor and got to the thing underneath, which was not cold and not guarded at all, but was, in fact, the most ordinary kind of human hope, the kind that just wants somewhere safe to land. He looked up and found Caleb looking at him. "Thank you," Jesse said. Not like Nora said it. Not bright and immediate and unself-conscious. Quiet. The way you said something when you'd been carrying the need for it for so long that saying it out loud felt like setting down a weight you'd forgotten you were holding. Caleb nodded once. He didn't trust his voice entirely in that moment. Ruth stood, picked up her coat, and said, "I'll leave you to it," which was her version of a great deal more than that. The weeks after were not simple. Simple wasn't the country they were living in. There were depositions and hearings, and Aldrich's lawyers making noise about jurisdiction and procedural irregularities, which Judge Fry disposed of with the efficient impatience of a man who had no time for procedural irregularities. Vane testified for 3 hours, and was thorough, and gave details that Aldrich's lawyers couldn't explain away. Jesse testified in a Cheyenne courtroom in February, with his hands flat on the table, and his voice level, and his memory exact. And the jury looked at this boy, and at the gold ring on Aldrich's finger, and at each other. And the verdict came back in 4 hours. Nora's testimony was deemed sufficient through Jesse's account, plus her written statement, plus Margaret Holt's professional assessment that the child was credible, specific, and not to be discounted because of her age. Nora herself took the news that she would not have to testify in person with equanimity, and then immediately asked if they could stop at Ruth's store on the way home, because she'd been thinking about the peppermint sticks. They stopped at Ruth's store. Ruth had the peppermint sticks on the counter before they got through the door. Winter ended the way it always did. Not surrendering, but simply, eventually, running out of arguments. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, revealing ground that looked confused by its own uncovering. The road softened. The light stretched longer. The mornings stopped requiring immediate decisions about survival and became, instead, just mornings. Nora learned to read in full by April. She read everything she could get her hands on, and what she couldn't get her hands on, she asked Ruth to order from the catalog. And Ruth ordered it without comment and without limit. Jesse began helping Caleb with the actual work of the ranch, not following at a careful distance the way he had in the beginning, but side by side, shoulder to shoulder, asking the questions he needed to ask and absorbing the answers with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to everything. He had opinions about fences, strong ones. Caleb found this unreasonably satisfying. There were still nights when Jesse slept with his back to the wall. There were still mornings when Nora woke up startled and needed a moment to remember where she was, and that the where was safe. There were still questions in Jesse's eyes sometimes, quick and involuntary. The ones that asked, "Is this still real? Is this still holding? Is this the time it changes?" And Caleb answered them, not with words, but with the simple, repeated evidence of being there. At breakfast, at the fence line, at the table in the evenings with the fire going and the lamp lit, and no particular reason to be anywhere else. One evening in late spring, Jesse came in from the barn where he'd been fixing a hinge that had bothered him for a week, and found Nora at the table with a piece of paper and a stick of charcoal, drawing something in the concentrated, focused silence she brought to everything she cared about. He looked over her shoulder. It was the three of them. Rough, the way 7-year-old drawings were rough. The proportions uncertain, the details impressionistic. But recognizable. Caleb, tall, hat on, badge visible as a small star on his coat. Jesse, slightly shorter, standing straight. Nora between them, her curly hair a dark halo around a face that was, even in charcoal, unmistakably happy. At the bottom, in careful printed letters, she had written, "The Harrows." Jesse looked at it for a long time. Then he went to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat down across from his sister, and didn't say anything, which was the most Jesse way of saying something there was. Caleb came in an hour later, tracked mud on his floor as usual, hung his hat, looked at the drawing on the table. Looked at it for a long moment. Nora watched him looking at it. "You can have it," she said. "I made it for you." He picked it up carefully. He looked at the 3 stick figures and the careful printed letters and the small star in his coat that she'd remembered to put there. He went to the mantel. He moved Clara's photograph gently to the left, not away, never away, just making room, and set the drawing beside it. He stood back and looked at both of them together. The woman he'd loved for 15 years, who had told him not to let grief make him small. The 3 figures a 7-year-old had drawn in charcoal on a spring evening, and titled like it was simply the name of a thing that already existed and had always been going to. Some things you lost, and carried the loss forever. That was true, and he'd learned it the hardest way a man could learn it. But some things you found when you had stopped looking, or rather, when you had ridden far enough north that the world ran out, and the only direction left was the one where something was waiting to be found. He had not been looking for a family. He had been riding a fence line in the snow, going nowhere, filling time until time ran out. And then his horse had stopped, and everything had followed from that. Outside, the first real warmth of the year was moving across the land, slow and certain, burning off the last of the ice in the low places. Inside, the fire was lower than it needed to be. They didn't need it much anymore. The nights were getting easy. But it was there, steady and present, the way some things were just there because someone made sure they were. Nora was reading. Jessie was thinking, which looked from the outside like staring at the table, but which Caleb had learned to recognize as its own kind of work. The house held the 3 of them, and their 3 separate silences, and the particular fullness of an ordinary evening that had no drama in it, no emergency, no threat pressing at the walls. Just this. Just here. Some things, once found, were never meant to be left behind. Caleb Harrow had learned that the hard way, standing in the snow over a fence post with a crumpled note in his fist, and 2 children who had no reason to trust him, and a badge he hadn't worn in 3 years, and a grief he'd mistaken for the rest of his life. He had been wrong about what the rest of his life looked like. He was not wrong anymore.